and I'm excited to talk to you all about infusing liberation into your performance management. You should have access to the Q&A. So as I'm going, I hope that you'll add questions to the Q&A, and we'll have a chance for hopefully the bulk of our conversation to have a conversation about the questions that you have about how to do this. And so I'll just get us started. If you've ever shared space with us at the Equity Practice, I always begin when I'm sharing space with folks with a land acknowledgement, and I do that primarily because my friends and colleagues that are Indigenous have asked me to do it to remind us all that they're still here and there's still something to be reckoned with in this country. I am coming to you from the land of the Tawakanni, Wichita, Kickapoo, and Jumanas people in a place that's sometimes called Dallas, Texas. And I acknowledge these people as the past, present, and future stewards of the land that I'm on. I also acknowledge people whose names we won't ever know because of the harms of colonization. I acknowledge the harm that happened to all of these people as the country was colonized, land was stolen, families were separated, and people were killed so that others would benefit from that land. And as today is the first day of November, it's the Day of the Dead in some communities, All Souls Day in others. And so it's a day that a lot of us recognize our ancestors and recognize those who came before us. And even November, when you think about November in the States, we celebrate Thanksgiving. When we think about in some communities, think about what happened when the colonizers came and what they received. And so when you think about constantly receiving and taking and never giving back, what do we have to reckon with? What do we owe the people who were here before? And I think we owe them quite a bit. In addition to being on stolen land, I'm on land built with stolen labor. I live really close to a huge plantation site. In fact, one of our big foundations here in Dallas is on that site and in one of the old houses, which is wild. And so when you think about these two original sins of stealing land and stealing labor and extracting and never reckoning with it, what might it be like if we did? What might be possible for our country and how we might unite and connect better and have a place where we all could thrive if we could just deal with and reckon what happens between us. And so I'm just going to pause here. Normally, I would welcome people to add into chat any acknowledgements that they have of land or people that they want to call in, but I'll just pause here for us to call it in spiritually together. If there's any people or land that you want to call in, we'll pause here for that. And if you're curious, if you actually don't know who were stewards of the land you're on, I'm putting up a QR code of this site that is a global site. It's a tool that sort of collects it's constantly being updated with the names of the people who stewarded the land around the globe, along with treaties that have been broken along the way. So if you want to learn more, it also is a great way to connect to those communities so you can find out what it is that they're asking for repair so you can act in solidarity with that. My name is Alli. I am one of the co-founders of the Equity Practice. I'm a Black cisgender woman, and you can use she and her pronouns to refer to me. As someone who's spent almost my entire life navigating predominantly white spaces, I'm acutely aware of how my identity has shaped my experiences. And it's a lot of the reasons why I do the work that I do now. At the Equity Practice, we support people to infuse liberation and reciprocity in their workplaces and change how power moves in organizations and how people relate to each other. I'm also really passionate about restorative work. And so whenever there's interpersonal or organizational harm that happens, I like to help people find their way back to each other, redesign how they work together, and chart a more accountable path forward together. And this work is truly an act of solidarity. I feel lucky to share space with you all and just talk a little bit about some of the ideas that we use in our work. So today, I'm going to be walking through us some concepts around some patterns of dominance and oppression that can show up in talent practices like performance management. I'm also going to share some ideas for disrupting those patterns, and then we'll spend the majority of our time brainstorming about how we can use liberatory principles in practice when we get to the Q&A. Okay. So before we dive in, I just want to start with some shared language about performance management, because when I talk to people about performance management, they can say a wide range of things. So When we're talking about performance management today, what I'm talking about are all the things that govern work and drive outcomes. And that includes what is the work, so anything related to work assignments, what are expectations around that work, how are we monitoring the work, how that work is going, and then how did it go? So how we evaluate the work. And then finally, how is that information about those work outcomes used to make other talent decisions, say compensation, advancement, separation, how people develop and whatnot. So when we're talking about performance management, that's what we're going to be talking about today. Our workplaces are inequitable. On your screen, you'll see some recent headlines about women and people of color and how they're less likely to be hired, mentored, promoted, and less likely to stay in their organizations. These outcomes aren't just disappointing. This type of work environment actually adversely affects people of color and women. It steals from financial wealth and contributes to health issues that take years off of our lives. There's research that says Black women in particular will lose 9 years off of their average lifespan because of what happens at work, some of these harmful environments that people are in, and they'll lose about $900,000 over the course of their lives. Our everyday work practices, the things that we do to get work done, are the reasons behind a lot of these inequities. Traditional business was created to extract more value out of workers than is given back to those workers. So if you were in business school or if you've ever studied any of these practices, they talk about let's maximize shareholder wealth. And that's really about how do we extract as much value from people, land, communities, and shift it to the capital owners or the shareholders. And so businesses are able to stay in extractive relationship through some of these dominating practices that they use. And so we're going to talk about 4 types today. The first is about creating hierarchical systems of domination and subordination. And so the ways that this shows up at work is that we use this illusion of objectivity where the dominant group creates norms and performance archetypes that preference the dominant culture. And this is how bias gets embedded and codified into organizations. Resource and power hoarding is when the dominant group gets to decide who gets power and resources and tends to benefit that dominant group. This happens both consciously and subconsciously. And when I say resources, I'm talking about things that we probably think of often, like money, time, and capacity. But there are also things like care, comfort, who gets rest, who gets the benefit of doubt, things like that. And what you see is that those types of things, like care and rest, are not equitably distributed. Dividing and conquering is an old tool of oppression that has been around a long time. And at work, it shows up when we focus on the individual and prevent people from interacting with each other. So I've actually worked in places where people would say things like, you're not allowed to talk, departments aren't allowed to talk to each other. And so that's a tool to keep people separated. And it often creates an overly competitive work environment and prevents people from seeing their collective power, which is a great tool for disrupting extraction. And so if you can't see that you actually have power collectively, it can keep you participating in the system. And then the final body of practices that we'll be talking about today is coercion and intimidation. And this is how fear is used to motivate staff. So whenever you are emphasizing scarcity or harsh consequences for mistakes, you're using fear to control staff, and it can have many consequences. These types of work environments tend to be less psychologically safe, which can negatively affect performance, and staff tend to be much more myopic and less innovative. And research shows that these types of places that use lots of fear and scarcity, people are less likely to help those that they perceive to be in the out group. And that continues the inequity that we see. So how do some of these patterns of oppression and extraction show up in performance management? So starting with domination and subordination, and again, this is about the ways that we use the illusion of objectivity to benefit the dominant group. One example is these false objective performance measures in performance management. For example, one very clear one is professionalism standards. They're often written to center things like Caucasian hair or Western European dress. And so people whose hair is naturally different than Caucasian hair will be deemed unprofessional using these types of measure, or if their formal dress is different, then they're not actually allowed to show up as their authentic selves and be seen as professional, because these measures have been written for one culture in mind. And so you can see how that can contribute to some inequities. On resource and power hoarding, people in a dominant group are more likely to be seen as having potential. There's lots of studies about this, and therefore they get more stretch assignments at work, which means that they're more likely to be able to grow and make them stronger promotion candidates. On the flip side, people from marginalized groups are more likely to receive assignments that are too easy for them, and also to be assigned work that's not mission critical or does not get considered during advancement conversations. So who's on your DEIB committees, who's doing the extra recruitment work? And often when we're talking about promotions and whatnot, those types of activities are not considered when people are making decisions like that. Dividing and conquering. This is, again, when we're focusing on the individual performance. And what we know for a lot of our work, it's so interconnected. So individuals are rarely singularly responsible for results. And so when we set goals that are focused on individuals, it can reinforce this idea of individualism. And what you see is some people get credit for things and other people don't, right? And that tends to, like, there was a study that showed in meetings, for example, you're much less likely to remember that a Black woman in particular has said something, and you're much less likely to give her credit for that. And that plays out in many aspects of performance, right? And so when we have individualized goals, it perpetuates that, where you're more likely to see the contributions of individuals instead of how their work is interconnected. And again, that separates staff interests from each other and contributes to some of this scarcity and winner-take-all approach to doing work, which hinders collaboration and performance. And then in coercion and intimidation, the ways that this can show up in performance management is because of bias about ability. Women and people of color tend to be hyper-surveilled, meaning that you're looking for mistakes because you assume there's going to be a mistake, so you're looking for it. And so it's not that women and people of color are making more mistakes, it's that they're more likely to be observed. And so they're more likely, women and people of color are more likely to be punished for their mistakes than men and white people. And then that you can see how that might flow through when you're talking about performance management and have a negative outcome. So what do we do about this? We're talking about all these patterns of oppression and domination. How can we address that? The antidote for oppression is co-creating a more reciprocal relationship instead of extracting. How can we be in relationship that centers reciprocity and mutuality and all of those things in the workplace? There are 4 antidotes for the 4 patterns that we just talked about. So self-determination is an antidote for creating hierarchical systems of domination and subordination. And so this idea is really about how groups and individuals can have more autonomy and sovereignty about defining their own reality. So what the standards are, how do we have many ways of doing work? How do we have many ways of being excellent at work? Power sharing is an antidote to hoarding power and resources. Here, you're thinking about how can we distribute who has control over decisions, resources, things like that, so that everyone affected by the resources and decisions is able to weigh in about that. Solidarity is an antidote to dividing and conquer, and solidarity is about how can we act collectively for our own liberation, right? Liberation is a collective act. And so here, the way I like to think about it is, and in almost every circumstance, I have power and privilege. I may not have the most, but I always have power and privilege. And how am I using whatever power and privilege I have to act for the benefit of the community? So when I'm in a room that other people aren't in, how am I speaking in ways that benefit the entire community? And then finally, abundant care is an antidote to coercion and intimidation. This is about the ways that you can practice care of generosity, of how are you making sure there's rest, resource, comfort, care, help. How are you making sure that everyone has access to this? And I actually just wrote an article about this, of expanding this type of care and advantage to everybody on the team. So it's about that principle as well. Okay, so how might these four principles show up in performance management? So for self-determination, this again is about autonomy, sovereignty to define your own reality. Here you could have individuals define the expectations or goals that govern their roles. Of course, it's within the parameters of their role, right? You can't, we're not saying that people are creating a whole new role, right? So that's what the reciprocity and mutuality is about, is that we're trying to create something together as an organization. We're working towards something together, and this is my role. How do I have more autonomy to define my reality, given what we're trying to do together? Power sharing. This is where in performance management, it could look like the team being involved in goal setting. If you do organizational OKRs, for example, I'm reading the book What Matters right now by one of the grandfathers of OKRs. And he actually says, and a lot of the research about OKRs talks about this, of not cascading, right? So if you're cascading your OKRs, you might want to stop that practice. And the reason he talks about not cascading is because there's wisdom everywhere on your team, and you want to take advantage of that wisdom and all the vantage points about the work to help decide the strategic direction of what you're going to focus on, which is very different than a lot of us have thought about what should we be focused on. Like it comes from the top, right? It doesn't have to be that way. What might be possible? What innovations might happen if we open it up and have a more collaborative approach to goal setting and thinking about what we're focusing on. Solidarity, the ways that this could show up is like thinking about how you can get multiple perspectives in performance evaluation. So a lot of times what you'll see in performance management systems is manager, one voice gets to decide and say what is true about somebody's performance. The research does not support that at all. There's actually single raters are really bad about rating performance. And if you want a more accurate view of performance, you actually want to have multiple raters looking at something. And when you look at single raters, you think about that individual's bias can actually really affect what's possible for that employee. And especially in these organizations where you have mainly white men or white people in the management lines evaluating people of color in the front lines, it's really important to think about like how do you invite other perspectives about performance, because just because I'm a manager doesn't mean what I am seeing is complete truth. That's just how I am perceiving the performance, right? And when I'm viewing somebody, I am viewing it through the lens of my biases, of our history together, all of those things, and it might not be 100% accurate. I know that's true for me. So making sure that you're thinking about that and disrupting that is a way to act in solidarity in performance management. And then finally, in abundant care, the way that it could show up is removing ratings. So there's some research that says when we rate people, it actually triggers a threat response that sends people into fight, flight, freeze, or fawn mode, which, having a threat response is not necessarily always bad. A stress response is not always bad, but being in a constant state of being in a threat response is bad. It actually takes years off of your lives. And it actually also does not help performance. This is what the research will tell you. Abundant care would be an example of removing those things that are harmful for people, especially when they actually don't help us perform better. So that's an example of care. So we use these liberatory principles in the ways that we help organizations redesign their practices. And we use a framework for change that builds off of the work of Dr. Barbara Lev, who talks about developing a liberatory consciousness to help guide that change. So we first start with building our capacity to see the oppressive patterns at play. We talked about those earlier today. Then we look at the processes and deconstruct them. So think of it like an accordion. You're pulling it apart and looking at all the behaviors and mindsets and all of the practices that are going on that are contributing to the inequity. So when we're talking about performance management, you would see, oh, there's one person's opinion that we're using to create a rating, and that's the truth that we're using in our system. And so then you can see there's an area that we need to rethink and reimagine. Then we co-create with liberatory principles. Again, because liberation is a collective act, we really believe that it's important to design with everyone in mind and having everyone participate in that conversation. When you're working to reimagine as a team, you go from centering those in power to being more like in a circle, where every point in the circle is equidistance from the center. And you're thinking about everyone's needs and balancing that. And then finally, we practice what we've designed. Operating in liberated ways requires to operate counter to everything we've learned at home, at workplaces, school, religious institutions, everywhere. So you have to unlearn some of these common ways of operating and practice and learn new ways of being. And so as people use these, there are three ways that some challenges come up. We see them fall into three categories of ways that people can sometimes have challenges. One is in finding the patterns, right? So because these practices of oppression are part of our regular and everyday traditional ways of doing things, it can sometimes be hard to see the ways that we might be complicit. So a manager might be rating women significantly lower despite similar performance from men, but because we never look at it comprehensively and look at trends, we might not see that. Reimagining, again, because these are new ways of operating, sometimes it's hard to come up with what could be different, right? So you might have questions like, oh, I'm not sure how I might use abundant care in performance management. And then finally, this is probably the trickiest one, is our own resistance to shifting and changing. So we've all internalized oppressive ways of working and belief systems. That's how they keep going. And often there's some assumptions that we're making about the world that are not true, and we have to work to unlearn them. An example in performance management could be internal ideas about quality and identity. If you've ever heard somebody say something like, if we diversify our hiring pool, how do we know that it's going to be high quality? That is an example of an internalized idea of quality and identity that someone should probably work to unpack and unlearn. Some of the questions that we often hear from folks about performance management and using these liberatory principles, you'll see some of these if the challenge is about finding the pattern or reimagining or tackling resistance. Some questions we've heard is, how do we make sure to maintain the focus on performance while allowing for autonomy, right? So you can see there's the reimagining, that might be at play. And then there's some resistance, right? There's an assumption in this question that if someone has more autonomy, they won't perform. Another question I've heard is, how do I ensure we do high quality work when working in liberatory ways? Again, an assumption about the quality if people have freedom, which is just like fascinating to me. That we assume that if people have more freedom, they just won't do anything. And then a third question is, how do I address underperformance in liberatory cultures? Again, you can see some of the assumptions that are there, or even like the challenges about reimagining. Okay, so that's it for me. I'm curious what questions you all have, and I'm putting on the screen, again, just a reminder of performance management. As you think about how you might apply these principles and disrupt, like what questions come up for you, and you can put them in the Q&A and then we'll answer them. And if you're willing to come up on stage, I don't know if we can bring people on stage, but assuming we can, maybe we can come up and have you come up on stage and we can have a conversation together. But feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll just work through them. What questions do you all have about applying liberatory principles to performance management? I see. Thinking about competencies. Is there a more collective design process? Would you effectively be mitigating for harm, or do you think they would be too much of a minefield? Thank you, Rebecca. I think that there are ways to do collective design processes that allow for both autonomy and consistency. So when I was a COO in my last organization, we actually would go do an annual process where we'd have people we had this thing called a one-pager that defined your charge of your role and then your 3 big goals for the year, and then the ways that you wanted to use your strengths to achieve all of that. And so we would do this process that helped people pull from a set of competencies, and it looked different. Like somebody could be in the same role, but have different competencies that they were emphasizing. The truth about our brains is we can't hold 100 things and work towards 100 things at a time. And some of these competency processes that I've seen can have like hundreds. Like when I worked at TFA, I remember our leadership development competency system was 100 pages. And I remember thinking, I was like, there is no way any one human can take 100 pages of things and live into this 100-page, very detailed document. And so I think what I find really helpful is to remember how our brains actually work instead of trying to design this like perfect thing on paper that I think we sometimes focus on when we're thinking about all has to be the same. And it's, why do you think it all has to be the same? Where did you get that idea? And what does that serve? So hopefully I'm answering your question, Rebecca. If I'm not, ask it again and we can maybe have you come up and we can talk about it. The next one is, we have given staff more autonomy, but we're struggling with some underperformance. What would you recommend to give them another chance? And this person's anonymous, so can't invite you up on stage. But what I find when it comes to underperformance is that people are trying to, in our current like traditional ways of operating, we use these tools so that we don't have to be in conversation with each other. So I don't have to tell you you're underperforming. People want to be able to avoid conflict, right? Like we're trying to distance ourselves from people and use rubrics to be like, oh, it's not me that's saying you're underperforming, it's the rubric. And so I think the first thing about underperformance is making sure you're actually having a conversation about it. Because what I've found with the organization that I've worked with is that often they're not having that conversation. They're talking about people's underperformance, but maybe somebody hasn't had a very direct, candid, clear conversation with someone. And so I think it is fine to say, here is the sandbox in which you are asked to, like, you, in exchange for compensation, I'm asking you to do this type of labor, and here's the outcomes we need you to do. And if somebody is not doing that, even autonomy isn't about not doing it. Autonomy is about how I do it, how I perform. And so making sure you're having that feedback conversation, making sure you're getting multiple perspectives about, is it truly underperforming? If you're focusing on outcomes and you're like, yes, the outcomes indicate that's true, and having that conversation and making sure it's clear about what those expectations are is what I would focus on. And again, if I didn't answer it, ask it again and we'll try again. What are some good practices for bringing other voices into the evaluation? So one thing you can do is having a 360 feedback processes. In fact, a lot of people encourage like this continuous feedback processes where you're constantly asking your peers, clients, whomever you're working with, about their perspectives about your work. And so I think the more you can do that regularly, then the more you have a suite of feedback. And ultimately, feedback is intended to help the person grow, right? Like all of us learning and building the muscle of asking for feedback creates more safety, not only for us as the receiver of feedback, but for the givers of feedback. It creates more psychological safety. And if we just remember to ask that all the time in multiple directions, that's a way that when you get to, if you do have a biannual review process, you can then look at all of that feedback that you collected throughout the year and use that. But I think really like thinking about how are we making sure we're getting it from multiple people is the way to do that. More of a quick resource question. Are there some of this content available as a document? I like the flow. Thanks, Jose. I'm glad you like the flow. I'll make sure I send out the deck as well after our session. So you'll get a copy of that. Okay. Can I describe cascading OKRs again? So a lot of organizations, when they do OKRs, which OKRs is a goal setting framework that talks about objectives and key results, which objectives are what is it that you're trying to accomplish, and the key results are the milestones, activities, outcomes that you need to achieve to get to that objective. And what the people who created the framework say is that you should not cascade. And so cascading is this idea of like you start with the goals at the top of an organization, and then the next level builds their goals to align, and then you just keep going down the organization until everything is perfectly aligned. So all the goals feed into each other. And if you've ever participated in a cascading goal process, you know how tedious it can sometimes be, and people end up with goals that are not at all meaningful for their body of work. So if I am the ops person and I'm forced to think about how my goal ends up in fundraising, I'm twisting and turning and like trying to come up with this thing that actually doesn't have anything to do with my day-to-day work. When you look at the research around goals and how goals actually helps us with performance, it's really important that it's directly tied to the work that I do, and that I'm able to monitor how, when I do X, this is how it changes the outcome. And so when you cascade, you lose that ability to do that. And so what the people who came up with the framework suggest is that you have an iterative process where you don't tell people what their OKR should be, but people say, these are the priorities that I think I should be focusing on at this time. And then you look at it collectively and revise so that you can make sure the body of OKRs are pushing in the direction you've collectively decided you want to go. But that's what that concept's talking about. And if you have a follow-up, please add that again. What recommendations do you have for redesigning competencies, performance appraisal forms through an equity-centered lens? We have staff at our org who don't believe the competencies are fair, and I agree. If the competencies aren't fair, then don't use them, would be my recommendations. I really personally like having I guess like a skeleton or a frame around which people can create their own competencies. So we have a single format, or we help people define what it is that we're using in those competencies that are appropriate for their role, their strengths and whatnot, and then using those in your system. I think it does require that if you're using a performance management system, that there's lots of flexibility in that system. And so that's the benefit of using a sometimes more expensive system, is that it allows for some of that flexibility that I think creates more equity. If you want to share more about like some of the challenges the staff are bringing up about the competencies and what the leadership team, I assume that there's someone who doesn't want to change it, what they're pushing back on, if you can add that to the question, and I can circle back and answer that more if you like. What are some of the most effective tactics I've seen to convince leadership of liberatory practices? For example, when a leader believes giving people autonomy will make them lazy. Yes, this is an interesting question. So whenever I've done any type of DEI or any oppression work, I often start with leadership teams and in fact, when I was a COO, we started here. We started with us, the leadership team, and making sure to talk about like some of these mindsets, because what we believe about our own identities and other people's identities, or even our attachments to what we believe about work and the ways that work happen, you have to do some of what they call that self-work to start to see those patterns. And so what I found to be helpful is reading about the history of some of those patterns and practices of oppression and domination, and how it's actually connected to things like slavery. So like the idea of people being lazy in the workplace comes straight out of slavery. When you think about the overseer, and they have to oversee the slaves so that they do the work, right? They have to be beaten. So like these ideas come out of these very oppressive systems that we've had throughout history. And so understanding that history and connecting it to the practices that we do today, I found really helpful to help people do some of that self-work. And then doing some identity work of what is it that I believe about value and labor and things like that, and unpacking that and testing those assumptions. So it's more of the adaptive work that goes with some of this technical stuff that we're talking about. When you change the actual practices, you have to do some of that mindset work with folks. And Lauren, hi, Lauren. If you have a follow-up, please ask that again and we can answer it again. I'm curious how to make the case for moving away from ratings when they're being used to access who is deserving of raises and bonuses. Yes. I recognize that people are not rated equitably, particularly when only only the work of some is centered. Yes. There's this great article. It's, I think, over a decade old now. It's called Kill Your Performance Ratings. So Kill Your Performance Ratings. If you Google, that can sometimes be a really great article to help people rethink that. And then it also offers some alternatives to raises. I've been thinking a lot about this because when we take goals or feedback and we use it for decisions like who gets what job and how people are paid, we actually break the goal. You turn something that can be very helpful for intrinsic motivation and turn it into something that's focused on extrinsic. And what we know based on like neuroscience and whatnot is that when you do that, people get much more myopic and less innovative. And then there's also some research that says that when you do that, people's feedback actually gets less helpful because they're so focused on helping the person get promoted. And so I have wondered if there are other ways that we can evaluate if somebody's ready or not, and if it could be through apprenticeship models or things like that. But I think though the tools that we're currently using are very biased, and we actually are breaking other parts of the system. So I think we probably need to rethink it completely. So half answer to your question, Andrea. I don't have the authority to remove ratings in our performance reviews. So what are some strategies for supporting staff and mitigating the trigger response? So again, if you can share the article and the research behind the ratings, I might want to start there. I found that can be really helpful, is using actual science. People that are resistant to things sometimes come around. And so when it comes to mitigating the triggers response, I'm not a psychiatrist at all, but I think what is happening from what I understand, when we have a response to a trigger, it's recalling a past trauma and our bodies are preparing us for the next thing. And so the ways that you can mitigate that response is to learn that just because in the past this thing was dangerous to you, it does not mean that when it's happening now, it is dangerous. And so there's lots of tools that you can use to help yourself unlearn that. For example, someone shared one of her employees got triggered whenever she said, I get triggered when my supervisor sends me an email. So it's not possible for this person to ever expect that they won't get emailed by their supervisor, right? That's a thing. But how does this person learn? And the reason they have that response is something happened, right? That was dangerous to them. And so it's like, how do they learn that they're safe is really what it's about. I think that's what you have to do if you can't stop triggering people. The argument I would make is that the ratings actually don't help you improve performance. So if you're like trying to improve performance, then the ratings actually hurt that. So if people don't care about the triggers, hopefully they care about the performance. So maybe that argument would work too. Okay, so private nonprofit agency differences. Okay, are there any examples of how you see the application of these differ depending on what type of an organization? So is it easier in a nonprofit compared to a public agency that has labor contracts that govern some of the structures and relationships? Nonprofits can also be unionized as well. And so I think my approach is definitely a more relational approach to work. And I think it does work in smaller organizations rather than larger. I think these types of tools work in places that people want to be anti-oppressive and want to operate in more liberated ways. If people don't want that, then that's going to be hard to do. And I think that you have to, if you do have a union or some sort of contracts that govern what needs to be true or not, then just work around that, right? So you're like, you consider that when you're designing it. But I think unless it says you can't have autonomy or you can't have variance, then, and it might say that, then you might have to like think about what other principles that you can use. So it just depends on what it says. What would performance review calibrations, or how would performance review or calibrations play into a more liberatory performance management system? I haven't found an effective way to do this with our people managers. John, it's probably because it doesn't work. People hate hearing this, but this idea of norming is not a real thing. So I hate to be the bearer of bad news on that one. But I think it's helpful to get multiple perspectives about how performance is going. And so instead of thinking about it like, how do we make sure we're getting multiple perspectives and then looking at all those perspectives to figure out what we think might be true. Ideally, I hope that management teams are thinking about not only like how do we help people do their best work, but how do we get better as managers, right? What would it look like if these calibration conversations, instead of being like, what's wrong with this individual employee, of, hey, do we see any trends across managers and who's doing really great and whose teams are getting better outcomes? And can we learn from how they're leading? Because what I think the research supports is you'll find that those leaders tend to be more liberatory. And yeah, I know I'm not really perfectly answering your question because I think calibrations aren't a thing, but I think thinking about how you as a management team want to use that data together and how you want to use it to help people and help drive towards your mission and what you're trying to accomplish. Okay. What might we use instead of ratings on competencies to give folks feedback on the impact of their work, whether informative or constructive, while creating consistency for staff, especially since it informs the salary increases? And if salaries aren't connected to competencies, what would be connected or based on? Great question. So the thing about ratings is they are not an objective measure. It's a false objective measure. We've been taught that this number is objective because it's a number, but everything in that number is a subjective thing. So just let go of this idea that the rating is objective, and without it, we don't have objective things, because it is your opinions that create the number. It is a subjective thing. So starting with that, I think what's really helpful for me when it comes to feedback is looking at the actual outcome. So what were the goals? What was the person asked to do? What were the expectations? If I am supposed to, say, register 100 people for an event, did that happen? And then when it comes to behavioral or core values things, that's why the multiple perspectives are so important, is how are we all experiencing the work from this person? And it is not objective, right? That is my opinion about what's going on. But how do we make sure we're taking into account multiple opinions when we're looking at it? And so you can look at those things, and when you're making those decisions, it's not that you're not thinking about the data when you're looking at these things. It's just recognizing that ratings isn't that type of objective data that we've all been taught that it is. It's not. So I think that helps. And then salary increases, there's a lot of research that shows that money doesn't actually change performance. So it can attract and retain staff, but it doesn't change performance. So you could shift to a more like tenured based increases and things like that, and thinking about like, how do we reward everybody for group outcomes? So if the organization is successful, how do we reward everyone and things like that? Okay. How can you support liberatory performance in a situation where an employee has a different idea what their scope of work should be? You should have a conversation about that and align on what the scope of work is. I think when someone's hired, being really clear, again, what is the work? What are the expectations for the work? If they want to advocate for change, because sometimes what we design, especially if you're in a small startup place, if you've ever designed roles, you will know, like sometimes you get it wrong. And it might make sense to rescope a role and rethink the body of work. So being in conversation with people and coming to agreements can be really helpful. And once you've agreed to something, this is the work, this is the expectations, then you can go from there. All right. I appreciate the insights, thank you, on performance management. I've seen cases where managers org struggle to focus on employees' results when the approach to the work doesn't align with the organization culture and values. I wonder what if you have insights to share on how to approach such situations. Yeah, I think getting really clear on what we mean by it doesn't align with the organizational cultures and values, because sometimes that is true. If you've ever heard of talented assholes, like some people are really talented and you've probably heard of this, like managers, and they are horrible to work for because they're jerks. And their behavior is not aligned to what you would expect from folks. So that is a real thing. And I think being able to use things like community agreements, core values, and being really clear. If you have a value, like we have a value at the equity practice, like we stay in circle. And so talking about what does that actually mean and how does it show up and making agreements around that. I think it's important to actually talk about that because you don't want people getting to outcomes in ways that are harmful. So I think being in conversation and a relationship around it are important. Okay. All right. So if ratings create a threat response, what suggestions do you have for giving merit increases if you don't have ratings? I don't love merit increases personally, just because I think when you look at the research, it doesn't make sense. So a lot of the way that I think about all talent practices is I start by learning about motivation, human response, and performance, and ground in that, because a lot of times our common practices actually don't do the thing that they are for. And so whenever something doesn't do a thing that it's for, I get rid of it. So merit increases are something to like think about. I personally like just doing regular increases for everyone. And then if somebody is ready to roll, then you promote them to the new role. But I think merit increases are something that are ways that you end up having lots of inequity, pay inequity. It's a way that does that because people tend to see more potential in men's behavior, more potential in white people's behavior. And so it's this like objective thing that, again, that creates all this inequity in the system. That's just my point of view about it. Okay. To the extent do you think redesign of performance related systems is worthwhile if you do not have champions for liberatory performance management in C-suite? Yeah, I think if everyone's not on board with operating in anti-oppressive or liberatory ways, then it's going to be hard to execute that. And so I think the way that I think about all of this work is that there's the technical side of things when you're redesigning practices, and that's what we're talking about today. And then there's the adaptive, right, of how do you shift mindsets and beliefs around human beings and what is needed for them at work. And so I think what I have found is you need to work on both of those things at the same time. And so even if you don't have champions, you have to, how do I shift that? If you want the technical to take, because if you don't have the adaptive with the technical and the relational is the third thing. I'm going to close this out. Thank you all for these great questions. I wish that we could have had you all up on stage with me too, because I know you just listened to me talk for an hour. But some tips from me about this is find ways to incorporate multiple perspectives in your performance evaluation system. It really will make it more rich, more equitable if you can have many voices in there. Examine work assignments because it is a place where a lot of inequity happens because people are not getting the same types of stretch and opportunities to really make a meaningful contribution. Disrupt any one-way evaluation models. We should be accountable to each other. So if you have something where managers are only evaluating people they manage, think about how you could have people who manage evaluate their manager, because how my manager is managing me affects a lot of my work life. And so we should all be accountable for the type of environment and the work that we're doing together. Don't design your performance management with underperformance in mind. When you look at curves of performance, people who are underperforming are typically a very small number of people. And so when we overly fixate on the fact that there might be somebody who doesn't do everything perfectly, we can end up creating a really punitive system. So don't design for that, but you do need to build the muscle to have the conversation about performance if you're going to do that. And then finally, be really clear about what it is that you're trying to do with performance management. If you're trying to improve performance, help people learn, then a lot of the tools, the traditional tools, the common tools, they need to be avoided because they don't actually do that thing. So just be really clear about why you're doing, why are you rating? What's the point? What are you trying to accomplish? And if that's true, does rating actually accomplish that thing? So if you are curious about working in with the equity practice, check out our website, www.theequitypractice.com. You can sign up for a newsletter there, and we share about public offerings. We actually have another webinar about restorative practices coming up in a couple of weeks. If you're curious and want to talk to me more about how I could support you to redesign any of your talent practices, you can use this QR code to set up a call with me. Please do. I love talking to people, even if it's just to brainstorm. Don't like, I always, whenever someone says book a call, I'm like, oh, I don't want to put time on your calendar. Please do. I'd love to talk to you. And so thank you all so much for your time today and for your time. And for those of you who had a chance to come to all 3 sessions, thank you so much. I don't know, Laura or Bree, if you want to say anything as we close out.
No, just love the conversation, echoing Alli's encouragement to reach out to us. We truly do get super pumped on these topics, and we've had incredible questions from all of you throughout the series. So we're going to send a coordinated note after this, and look forward to continuing the conversation. So happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, y'all.